All right, so what's happening in Texas? Texas is still in the midst of a huge fight over a complex election law bill. The shorthand is SB 7, which only refers to the Senate Bill 7, the bill number given to it in this last legislative session. This bill, which is quite complex and has a variety of provisions, would make voting more difficult for everybody in Texas, but particularly from vulnerable populations. And the ones that are really targeted, as I'll illustrate, people of color, people with disabilities, and people for whom English is a second language. It also prohibited local election officials from distributing vote by mail applications. Think about this one for a second. I mean, that's so strange. It's, local election officials are tasked with administering the election. You have a right to vote by mail if you're over a certain age or a person with disability, incarcerated, somebody who's in college, but your local election official is not going to be able to tell you about it or give you an application. It also empowered partisan poll workers who we know in Texas and nationwide, unfortunately have a history of voter intimidation against people of color. And that is not an ancient history. We saw it and we recorded it in 2020. And then finally, there was a last minute addition that would make it easier for politicians alleging fraud to have elections overturned with very limited proof. If that sounds familiar to anybody, it should.
So there are two federal bills that are, because it is one that is actually currently in the Senate and will be voted on as soon as next week. So I'm going to start with the content of the For the People Act. It is about 817 pages, which a lot of features that frankly are all needed. When people ask me why the bill is so big, I say it's because there is a lot in American democracy to fix. And so I like to joke that this is actually just Congress doing its job. This is what bills are supposed to look like, frankly, especially when there's so much to be done in this moment. I think the bill is doing three things that are very contextually important to understand. The first one is it is advancing the work that this country has been doing since 1965 and before with the civil rights movement. The example I'll give you to illustrate that is John Roberts gutted Shelby County, in Shelby County v. Holder, gutted the Voting Rights Act because he said discrimination is sort of different in America today. It's over. It's not like it was before. And what we see in the bills that have happened since then and the movements that have happened since then is that is very much not the case. Invidious discrimination, often race-based, is very much still alive in American law. And the quick example I'll give you, you've all heard about North Carolina, the law that targeted African Americans with surgical precision. Another example I want to equip you for is with another community. The Native American community was deeply affected when North Dakota was considering a voter ID law. A government official stood up in the legislature and said, your voter ID will require residential addresses. Native Americans will not be able to meet that requirement because the state does not assign them residential addresses. And even knowing that, the state legislature went ahead and established this voter ID requirement. And of course, the effect was to disenfranchise Native American voters. So that's sort of invidious discrimination in all sorts of ways that we can recognize.
I'm going to start out hopeful because I think hopeful is important. And I think we need to at least reflect where we're at. And that is democracy is winning. No mistake, there is a serious and ongoing struggle, but democracy is winning. It's not a struggle between Republicans and Democrats in my mind. It's a struggle between people who believe in democracy over authoritarianism. It's people who believe in facts, data, and science over lies and conspiracy theories. It's people who believe in justice and fairness over pure political power and greed, right? That's what the divide is. It is not a partisan divide. It is a divide amongst values amongst people. And if you look at the 2020 election, we had historic turnout during the worst health crisis the world has faced in a century, right? We forget that. Like, it's like in COVID is like the afterthought. But the people who believe in authoritarianism and lies and the abuse of power are mounting a huge national fight. It's financed by a lot of dark money. We don't know where it comes from, or we know it comes from, Heritage Action, and we don't know where they're getting it from. And it's clearly designed to silence the voices of voters. And it's doing that in two ways. First, it's just making it harder to vote, right? Just every way that we can think of to make it harder to vote, there are efforts to make it harder to vote. Second, and even more troubling possibly, is the efforts to try and use raw political power to actually overturn the results, not just to make it harder to vote, but to maybe even not count the results. And the last thing is just going so far as to actually making threats against election officials. And if you didn't see it, there's a Reuters special report today about threats to election officials in Georgia. And you should read it because it's scary, it's bad. So that is very anti-democratic. And so we're trying to make it harder to vote. We're trying to create systems that try and in ways limit the way that our votes, whether our votes get counted and how they get counted. And that is a big and bad push, and it requires us to be engaged.